Hey, thanks for joining us today. As you can see, sitting next to me virtually is my good friend, George Swisher, who's the CEO of LiiRN. That's LiiRN.com. And we came together out of a shared love of how do you make change really happen, and how do you make it happen like in our lifetime? So making it real and making it within a reasonable frame of time so that the change you're going for actually matters and the problems haven't so completely changed that you've made a change that doesn't fit anything. So George approaches it, and he'll talk about it in a minute, from the technology side. I approach it from the people side, and that brought us together, and we work together, work with companies to help accelerate change in their organizations, their culture. So George, tell us a little bit about LiiRN and what you love to do with it.
Yeah, well, I think, outside of it being a software, the idea behind building a technology that would help accelerate transformation is, can you really drive change from the bottom up? And, organizations and consultants, are really responsible for measuring the outcomes. And so for us, focusing on how do you automate the change management processes, as well as measure the outcomes, whether there's behavioral outcomes, whether those are factual business outcomes, whatever those things are, how do you plug those things together and do it in a dynamic way? Anybody can do it in a flat way, or things that could take 6, 9, 12 months to figure out, but change is so rapid. I think for us, we look at those shorter sprints, and how do you really figure out what's going on short term and make little changes towards a big long-term plan, right? I think that's essentially the root of what the software does.
Yeah, and that's great. And I think it's what that brought us together is that I mean, doing change work and being around people who are trying to do change work. One of the things you often run into is, yeah, so what? We changed. How do we know that's actually better? And so being able to not only see how we've changed and show that we have, but then connect that to the business measures that matter, takes out of the realm of a sort of an OD exercise into the reality of business. Well, let's talk about the new reality of business. So as we record this, we're in the midst of going through COVID-19 pandemic. And yeah, we're looking as well at some point, this is, and maybe the time you're watching this, it's happened, but this is going to ease up, and we're going to move into a new normal, or a new abnormal maybe is better, because things are going to change in a lot of different ways with remote technology, probably more here to stay, and a lot of things like that. What do you think about what's going to happen in the new abnormal?
It's not even what I think. I'd rather go through what I'm hearing, right? I think we're lucky in this scenario where we've seen an influx of business coming in, and I think what's happening and what I'm hearing from people is now you've got everyone took a big transition out of the workspaces and had to leverage how people can communicate, how they can work remote. And that was just a heavy lift for a lot of organizations to do that for their entire company, especially the companies that size of companies we're working with. And now they're saying, well, now that we've got everybody settled, we just took a pause on making sure we can stay alive and keep the businesses moving and keep as many jobs as we possibly can. Now we had this plan set up of what we're trying to do for the entire year, for the next 3 years. And what do we do now? How do we think about transitioning back into the work environments, and how do we not miss a beat because we already took a beating with our business over the last 2 months, 3 months? And so how do we transition it back, and what's needed to keep everybody focused while you're doing that? I mean, and I think the hard part for a lot of people is they look at the tasks that need to be done versus the emotions that people need to feel to get those tasks done, right? And I think if you can think about it that way, that's more what I'm hearing is like, okay, how do we remotivate a workforce that's now half the size it was before? They feel good that they were able to maintain their jobs, but how do we get them back into the office? How do we get them to understand where we're trying to now go and make up for what our business objectives were, while they're also shaken, right? Like, how do you do that? And how do you build the awareness and the adoption and, security, the sense of security? So I think that's what I'm hearing a lot of, like, what do you do to solve that? And what's needed? What's the bag of tricks you put together to do that? So that's what I'm hearing, I think is why people are scratching their heads going, what next? And I do think that, in times like this, it forces people to rethink their business models a little bit. And I think it's a big part of making sure it doesn't happen again, when something does potentially take place like this. How do you be a little more prepared for it? Because I think most people weren't. We weren't. We're a technology company. We're used to working more remote and through technology, and we weren't. It took me and our team a while to get reset up and just readjusted to work completely away from each other. So, so it's a new thing, but I don't think it's not new to most of the standing businesses, that you go through changing times and turmoil, and you've got to figure out how to readjust, and that's the mode they're in right now.
Yeah. As I was listening to you talk about the new business models, and we talked, before, and talk a little bit now about how do you get people focused, and how do you, engage them with the strategy, and how do you even determine what the strategy is now when a lot of your assumptions are out the window. And I think, as well as business models, what are the new people models? Because you've got a workforce that at scale lost their jobs overnight. The level of trust, but also the level of anxiety around could that happen again, is going to be huge. And so if we can't engage people in what we're doing and why we're doing it, I think, the model of, hey, up here we set the strategy and we, bring it down here and you just kind of execute it and trust us, that was under severe pressure and breaking already. Now it's gone. It's done. Anybody tries to go back to that, you're going to find people saying, you know what, I'm going to want to go work somewhere where I have some control over my own life, where I feel like I'm a part of what's going on. And I think that new normal, that new abnormal, is about broadly and widely engaging everybody in change and building that corporate change muscle. And when you and I talk about that, we talk about it from a couple of perspectives. I mean, myself and, what I've been engaged in, what I'm actually, writing my book on, is what are those human capabilities that you need to put into an organization, those behaviors that make your organization a highly changeable one that embraces and understands and moves forward. And where we've partnered is taking those exact capabilities, and I've leveraged the LiiRN platform to bring those out to the organization to help them understand clearly what the expectations are around how we behave and what matters now, but to also engage them in how are we doing, and saying, here's how we can improve it, and to say, I want to be a part of improving that. And we're going to measure that. And that measurement is all of us having a say, and we're going to gauge our own progress. And I just think that more inclusive net is going to be a must, as opposed to a nice to have or a maybe should have anymore. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, it comes back to getting buy-in, right? And people, especially employees, I feel like they don't trust companies usually from the start, no matter how big or small it is. They're everyone's focused on their own interests, and I think that's just the reality. And even what I went through in this transition as the leader of this company, it was really hard to feel good and be transparent and try to keep people motivated. So I can only imagine, someone who isn't responsible for that and is just taking the blow of whatever was decided.
Yeah.
And, I feel like at any point in the next, 6 months, I agree with you. I think people are going to need to almost take the rapid prototyping strategy and put it into the way that they plan and the way that they involve, not just small groups of people, but larger groups of people, just so they feel like there's some transparency at a minimum, right? And at the other end of the continuum, is that you actually involve people into making crowdsourced ideas. And there's so many capabilities and tools out there to enable you to do it that isn't about task management, right? It's really about empowering people to be involved. And what does it take to do that? And what are the emotional cues that they need to feel that they are heard or involved or to make decisions or whatever that is, right? that's going to build safety and trust. So I think that you can't create safety. You have to do things that the outcome is people feeling safe. Very, very different way of looking at it, right? So I think to
Yeah.
me that's the lens that most leaders have to put on now when they're dealing with motivating, especially large populations of employees.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to do safety. I love that. When I was writing down here as I was listening to you, I mean, it's thinking that, I mean, the contract has changed, and again, it was changing, but now we can see that it's fully changed. The contract of I do what you tell me to, and you give me a job for life is gone. But what's interesting about that is it means that there's a leveling out more and more. Not completely, but there's a leveling out more and more of power in the organization, and people have more power to go different places, more power to start things. I mean, would you have started the same company as gone out on your own from the job you had 10, 15 years ago? Would I have felt like I could walk away from a well-paying corporate role and just do what I do for companies and do it better independently 10 or 15 years ago? Probably not. It would have been a lot harder. Now it's not been hard at all. In fact, I don't find any lack of demand for my services, just like you're not finding any lack of demand for the services and products that you're building. And so when we think about as well engaging people, like you said, it's not just, some people start to get excited about, let's crowdsource it more, let's involve more people's opinions. And I think at the leadership level, they started to think, well, that gives us more ideas. That's useful, but still it's up to us. It's actually not going to be about leveraging. It's going to be about engaging. It's going to be about giving that to those people to make those choices. A friend of mine used to always say, you got to lose control to gain engagement. And I think that everybody wants engagement, but nobody wants to lose control. But one of the things that we've seen, is that we can completely lose control. And it's interesting. It's almost like COVID-19 has shown some of the emperor's new clothes being worn by our executive leaders around the world, is that they don't have it all figured out. They don't know what needs to be done. They're not anticipating it all. A good friend of mine talks about, trying to figure out, well, what are the unknown unknowns and what are we going to do about it? How are we going to be ready for the fact that they're going to show up? I'd love to hear from you. If you think about what you do with LiiRN to accelerate change, go beyond just the projects and the strategies that you're helping to accelerate, and tell me a little bit more about how you think it changes the organization itself and how it looks at change or looks at its response to the world around it and how it reacts.
It's a great question. Because I have my own biased opinion of, what I think our software does or how we intended it to do things. And then there's the reality of what feedback do we get. And, for the most part, the simplest way and feedback that we get is you're really able to help people understand what's important at the very high level of the organization. And, that isn't a one-way communication. I think I've heard you say this actually a lot of times, is that, someone standing on a podium in a town hall and broadcasting what's important isn't going to be as effective as a return on investment strategy when you deploy resources and money and tools that you're paying for to get people to do stuff. It needs to be a two-way street, right? And there has to be some control around it. Like to be realistic here, like running a 35,000 person company, it is hard to empower everybody and give everybody a voice. But I think what we've been able to accomplish is to kind of do that, but make sure that there are some controls in place where you can involve large groups of people. And it's really about activating the people who really want to do something outside of their traditional job responsibilities, right? And I think that's what everybody's trying to find, is where are those special little gems that are hidden throughout this large organization that you can pull together, that can be the evangelist, that can be the change agents, that can really drive an agenda forward that might be one or two or maybe even three of those key executive outcomes that need to happen for everyone to maintain having jobs. So I think that to me is where I get the most excited is how do we help, an ultimate dream is how do we autonomize some of the decision making that leaders have to do by capturing enough information of not only strategy, people's involvement and participation, and then all the middle stuff, right? You can
Yeah.
analyze all that and you could help a leader take 30% of their decisions if they're having to, guess or look at bits of pieces of static information and make a decision. You can make that in real time of what's really going on. That's pretty powerful, and I think that to me is when I look at where we're trying to go and what we're trying to inspire people, where people see the opportunity with using LiiRN, even though we may start down here where we're trying to get them to, is that piece, is really being able to help make larger decisions with larger groups of people, because you will have the best return on investment and impact, which is what you want. I'm going to
Yeah.
spend $10 million on a learning transformation program. I want to know if people are really going to adopt it. Well, the way to get them to adopt it is to involve them in the process. Well, how do you do that at scale? Well, you need something to do that, right? And that to me is where we're playing in that world, and we're able to enable the organizations to do that. That's the biggest feedback that we're getting. I mean, yes, there's a lot of little functions and features and things they're getting. There's great data and outcome they're seeing, but like being able to facilitate that process at scale is not an easy task. And we spend a lot of time trying to pick apart that journey to do that. And that to me is where I feel like people are seeing that it's doing it, and they can start, here, and it has the ability to keep snowballing into almost the entire organization. And that's a scary thing, but it's also a needed thing, at some point.
Yeah. You made a couple of comments there that, again, you make me think every time we talk here, but talking about kind of what's important, and people, people want to be listened to, but I think sometimes we're afraid to listen to people at scale because we think that, well, a meeting of 10 people, everybody talks for 10 minutes, that's, an hour and 40 minutes. So we have 10,000. We can't have a meeting for, 17 years. But the fact of the matter is that you don't need to be listened to all the time, and we don't need to listen to everything. We need to listen to the things that people say are important, and they can have a lot of that dialogue before we decide which of the two that we're going to pick out of the three we're going to do something with. So, a tool like LiiRN is one of those things where you can get you can do a lot of listening, and then a lot of people are going to see that they've been heard, and a lot of them were thinking the same thing, and we can get that kind of engagement. And I loved as well talking about what if you can save 30% of a manager's time, because there's a real opportunity, and maybe we should shift into talking about what to do with the time that can be created or should be created. I mean, we've been forced into having some extra time now, in the sense that we're not flying anywhere, we're not, commuting anywhere. So most of us should have some time that we didn't have before. And I'm kind of wondering, what are we doing with that time? And I was working with a client today, she'll remain nameless, but I was really enthused to hear that in the midst of all the stuff going on, and then their business is very strong with the industry they're in, that they were sitting down and we were asking me, how do we continue to move from being the kind of leaders we have to the leaders we need to be, which are these leaders that are listening more, that engaging more broadly. They wanted to learn these new skills. And at a time where you're in the midst of crisis and extremely busy, to say, we're still going to carve out in this time to figure out how to be better, so when we come out of this into the new, normal, we are better, I thought took a real presence of mind. And it wasn't coming from the HR function. It was coming from a serious hardcore business leader who said, we need to work on this aspect of ourselves, and was talking it through with, his leadership team. And I think it's really interesting to think about, what it is that we can do now, or what it is that we can learn now. So it'd be interesting to, I have a couple of thoughts, but I'd love to hear your
Yeah.
take on what can we do with the time that's been given us here.
No, you know, first, just to back up a little bit, I feel like, getting feedback at scale is not a new thing, right? We've been able to do that with employee engagement surveys, SurveyMonkey. There's definitely ways to get static information that you can analyze and group these settings. And I think the difference is how do you activate people from the collecting the information to doing something? And then how do you
Feedback to dialogue to action at scale,
rinse and
right?
repeat that, right? What happens when it changes and you have to redeploy that feedback and redirect people? So I think that's more of the topic in my thinking through this. And even just this week, I was sitting with an organization where their biggest concern is that they did have to transition a decent amount of employees out of the business, and now they're in a position where they are so fearful of the current people being overworked that they make mistakes. And in this business, it was insurance business where the mistakes they make are very costly. So for them, making sure people get direction, right? So to answer your question at a very high level, I believe that people always need direction. Even if you want to give open-ended feedback and you have democratized decision-making, even if you have all these very group-driven type of things, you still have to give people direction, right? And I think making sure the feedback loop and how you activate people is rooted in that direction, which is why it requires the leadership and the frontline people to establish what that is. That to me is where you can win, right? And I think
George, can I interrupt you for a second asking you, when you say direction, I think I understand what you're talking about, but are you talking in the direction is literally almost, this is where we're going, this is the outcome we're looking for, this is what we have to achieve as direction, not walk this way.
Not task,
walk this way as we're putting back to them, right?
Yeah, I think tasking people with things doesn't involve them in the true outcomes. And I think some of the things that we see come back from not only the end user, a lot of times the lower, frontline employees and the leadership stakeholders that are making decisions, is that, how they didn't realize some people who may not have been in key positions were able to contribute really great ideas and time that they didn't realize they had to dedicate and help out with something that was way beyond their pay level or their position or their department, things like that. So I think directing people where they can spend their time that they do have towards outcomes that you need. Again, a small organization that's 200 people, 500 people, to me, you can kind of manage this in person or remote or one-on-one-ish, right? You get into 1,000, 5,000, 30,000, 100,000 people, way more complex, right? And I think this is where we have to focus.
Yeah. As I hear you talking, the thing that comes to my mind is going back to that point of what can we do now? If you're watching this, you're an executive leader, you're a leader somewhere, what can you walk away with? I think one of the things you can do with some of the time you have and some of the time you should be creating is start to focus on goals, not roles, right? I mean, be sharing more of the goals, making sure people understand them. Now, obviously, we have a bias saying that the great way to do that is through the technology that LiiRN provides. But regardless of how you do it, you need to be getting out there, making sure you're communicating the goals. And because the goals actually could be shifting and changing as well.
Yeah.
You've got to keep your eye on that. You've got to be talking about it, engaging them in how they think they're going to get there. But spending the time to figure out how each of them and all their different areas are going to get there is not what you're going to have time to do. But engaging them in those goals and make sure that they understand and that they believe and that they're aligned to them is something we can do at the time that we have now, and something that's not going to change in a world where the problems we're solving are changing at a rapid and more rapid pace. And the complexity of those problems is only growing, and the unknown unknowns are getting bigger and larger to the point where they could be a global pandemic level of unknown unknowns. we're going to have to be communicating the goals and staying away from the roles.
Yeah. Well, I'm the first person to take, to me, LiiRN and technology out of the picture, right? If you just think from like a philosophical, how do you get things done? And a lot of work I got to do as a consultant previously, and the consultants we work with now is, having high level, broad and ambiguous pillars that the organization is rooted in doesn't really help people understand what it means to them and how they can contribute towards that. And what I do like about the base of our system is kind of rooted into a kind of pillars and drivers, right? And so
Yeah.
if you take those big high level things that usually get, broadcasted or communicated, hung up on the wall, all those types of things are important, right? If you can go a step lower and identify the specific drivers that will impact those objectives or those pillars, right, that you are broadcasting and speaking to at a broad sense, exposing your entire organization to that. It doesn't matter to me whether you're 10 people or 100,000 people. If you can expose people to those 10 to 20 complex drivers that impact you achieving those pillars, and let them be involved in the creation of it, the understanding of it, they'll build awareness by helping to develop those things. And it sets expectations of what is considered a good outcome and a bad outcome.
Yeah.
Right? People, to me, at an organization can attach themselves to a driver of some sort. To attach themselves to a huge objective that they don't really clearly understand how it impacts their daily job is more difficult. So I think using that framework, we use that framework is how the consultants plug those strategic items into our software. So I fully believe in that type of framework, to where you are taking those big things, breaking it down one more level. And even if you just communicate that, not how it's defined as here's the broad statement of what this means, clearly articulating this is a good scenario and this is a bad scenario. If you give people that range, they, one, can give you honest feedback on how they think you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Two is they can understand what's expected. So if I'm in a specific job function and I understand that, being the most, technological digital company we can be, right? That's one of my key pillars. I need something in between that to say, yep, I can help do that, be a part of this one thing. And I know it's big, right? Better systems and technologies specific to our department, right? I can identify with that and help contribute towards that. And that, to me, is where you get the adoption from people. So I think any size company can just use that framework to communicate one level down to the entire organization. And that exposure is going to give people, like we talked about earlier, a little bit more of those emotional cues they want, a little bit of transparency, right? A little bit more feeling like they're heard and they're involved. And that's what feeds into getting people engaged. Again, I think of employee engagement the same way. You can't make them be engaged. You have to do things that engage them, right? Same exact concept we were talking about earlier. So I think that's an outcome that you're trying to achieve. Involve them into a little bit of the details, not everything down to a specific key result that you have to see. If that's what it becomes, great. But you can definitely use that framework in any size organization, manually or technology. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. And you know how, I use, LiiRN two ways. One, with some clients, it's like, you've got your strategy. Great. We're going to help you build the pillars and the drivers so people can figure out how do we impact those drivers, which you just talked about. The other way I use it, of course, is, the concepts that I have. If they come to me and say, actually, we buy the strategy you've given us around these capabilities that we need to be a changeable organization, to be a transformative organization. I have the pillars, I have the drivers, and I've actually broken down behaviors. But what I've done is then said, look, here's behaviors that I've found. And there's two things that I engage people with. One, the behaviors that I've found. And two, what are the other behaviors in this organization that I haven't found or articulated that you can find? So it gives them something to go on. But together, we're building those things. We're creating the building blocks that end up driving the pillars which build the strategy. And all of a sudden our connection to the strategy, to the overall goals is much more crisp and clear. And it's hard to do that at scale. I'll never forget having someone, I worked in the pulp and paper industry early in my career, and I had somebody in an inside sales HR support role. So it was an HR person who supported inside salespeople. And one of the big measures, like the 5, they called them closely watched numbers in the company, was safety. And this person said to me, how do I impact safety? I recruit inside sales coordinator people who deal after the sale's been done. I have no impact on that. I feel disenfranchised. And we talked about it. And through the conversation, she realized that if she hired the wrong person, then their behavior might cause the mill to have to work late, put on an extra shift, scramble to get something done. And those are the circumstances in which, you know, a 100-ton roller would fall and kill somebody. And so all of a sudden she said, wait a minute, me doing my job well could save a life of somebody up in Quebec who might die if they have to scramble because this person does their job wrong. Right. It was a great, great moment, a great lesson. And she found ways to connect to more of the business. But you can only have so many of those conversations as individuals, where if you can leverage something to help people find those things, maybe to share some with them like I do, maybe to have them find their own like most people do with LiiRN, then that connection, that strategy becomes owned. And it's one of the holy grails we're always talking about in organizations. How do we get everybody on board? Well, you get them on board by inviting them in and letting them figure out what their place is, right? I mean, you have to let them be a part of that.
Yeah, and it's not an easy task, right? I think
no.
You know, there's a lot of complexities in different kinds of organizations, and I always think of how do you start, right? And I think this is maybe the second takeaway is if you can help expose people to a little bit one level below with some clearly defined good and bad scenarios. I think that framework is so educational. And so then 2 is, you know, how do you start with what's good enough? And I think some organizations, especially the larger the organization you get, they feel like, you know, when I see some of the planning that I would do as a consultant is that they're looking so far out, and you have to, and I get you have to have that visionary view of where you want to go, but figuring out what you need over the next 3 to 6 months and start there, because, you know, things change so rapid now. And so trying to find a way of getting good enough, right? Just get enough information of what you think, you already know those defined pillars are. Most of the work I see the consultants do are defining the drivers, right? The specific bite-sized things that people can interact with and you can activate groups of people around. Defining those and just getting enough started, right? Because once you push it to a larger population, you will discover, just like you said a second ago, where some of the gaps are that you didn't see. You know, because you can't see when you're at the top or the mid-level organization that's very large, right? You don't see what's going on the front line all day long. So I like the idea of always trying to figure out how to do good enough to get it going, because the speed is what I think organizations are missing now is most important. It's not, you know, the concept of agile, those things I think are great for internal workflow, but speed is everything. Time kills everything if it takes too long. So that, to me, that rapid side of getting started doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be enough to get you going and rapidly change and move over time and have the tools or the people to help you do that. To me, I think is another big foundational part to solving these big problems that people are dealing with now.
You know, you made me think of, used to work with somebody, we'd talk about the power of adequate. And I can't tell you how many times as a business leader, when I had people coming in and there's like, oh, we got to do this, you know, this thing. And we really don't think it's necessary what they're asking for. We don't think it adds value. They're complaining about it. And I say, well, I'll tell you what, do an adequate job. They're like, you want me to turn in adequate work? I said, can you define adequate? Well, adequate, it's good enough. I said, yeah, good enough. good enough is good enough. If you don't think it adds value, I mean, you complain, you say it's a huge waste of time task, and then you do 7 versions of it to get it perfect, because we live in this world of it's got to be perfect. And
Yeah.
what I love to hear you saying is, hey, leaders, find some things that are good enough, and then get into action. Listen to what people say, you know, so there's the speed, get going. I mean, I start thinking about, as we formulate some takeaways here, it seems like a couple of things that are emerging. One is, you've got to be using some of the time you have and will have to constantly communicate the goals, and realize that people will figure out how they need to meet them, but they've got to know what they are and feel connected to them. When you're sharing goals and you're sharing how we're going to get there, you need to get good enough so you can get going quickly, and realize that they will also help fill in those blanks. And when they feel listened to, you'll start to refine and go from good enough to really, really good, really quickly, with a larger group of people contributing to it. So when you get to really good, everyone's committed to it, as opposed to, I love, I mean, I can't tell you how many, you know, dusty binders I've seen from name brand consulting firms.
I can pull it up out of my drawer right now if you want me to. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And it's like, here it is. And it's a perfect plan. Nobody does anything with it because nobody owns it or feels committed to it. But if you put an adequate plan out there and then say, what do you think? How are we going to do this? Or adequate goals, that really engages. And I love your last point as well about just get going. Just get going. Stop overthinking it. Get enough, and then move forward, and then start listening and let it improve. I mean, that's the heart of Agile. I hear all these companies talking about Agile, and all they want to do then is put in a new lengthy process, as opposed to realize that Agile is about, you know, people and interactions over process. It's one of the, I'm paraphrasing, but one of the laws, you know, get it going. So if you had to, I named a couple, but how would you sort of summarize for somebody who's, you know, taking the time to engage and watch today, what is maybe our, at the risk of sounding like we think we know something, what is our advice to them as they, you know, walk away or click done when they're done listening here?
I think while you were talking, the third thing I think is critical, and this to me probably wraps up everything, is activate the people who are willing to do stuff. I think a lot of organizations spend so much time worrying about the total count of people who did maybe a little bit, and they use that number as a success factor. I had 80% of the people participate in X, right? But we all know there's the 80-20 rule, right? That 20% of the people of that entire group really are the ones that are doing stuff or willing to do stuff. And I think that population is the most important. And I think, you know, for us, you know, we've seen, you know, roughly probably the smallest number is about 30% of a population has raised their hand to participate in something, right? Where we may see 80% complete an assessment or a survey function, right? And to me, that 30% population is incredibly more valuable than the people who just gave me a little bit of feedback. I want the people, and this is how we do it in my organization, it's the work I did as consulting, activating the most involved people who want to do something regardless of, and I've had some of the best ideas come from completely unexpected people and roles by making sure I focus on who's the real group that wants to do something, and let me activate them, because what it will do not only is get you moving, which we talked about, is when you start empowering those people and they start talking to their peers about how they're getting the ability to execute very senior things or being involved with very senior people, because you have to remember, they're thinking about career development. How do I go from here to here? Well, I want to be friends with these people, right? So if they're getting to work on something that they know is tied to this person and they're feeling like they're way down here, they start to talk, right? And when they talk, it makes other people want to get in. We all know the whole concept of FOMO, right? So when you create this exclusive group, which I know is not the best way to think about it at times, but if you do a big population, you get a group, there's only 10% is ready to do something, that's not a failure. You have 10% of that population that are going to be your best evangelists and you're going to have the best return on investment in what they do. And you most likely will have a halo effect to other people because people will be afraid of missing out on what they get access to when they're working on something directly tied to an outcome that they understand is tied to the overall organization. To me, that concept, again, lives at any type of company, any size of company, it doesn't matter. That concept works every time. Take this the group that wants to do it, give them the money, give them the resources, empower them, let them run, and you will be so surprised at how fast they move and how they get other people on board because they all have friends of like, check out this cool thing I'm doing, and they recruit people. And that's what you need. So you let the frontline people recruit other people versus trying to force people to be involved in stuff. I think that would be my last takeaway on how you really move things forward.
Cool. All right. Well, I think, what we tried to do here, and hopefully we've done a good job, is, George and I just love thinking together, love working together. It's been a great partnership and relationship since we formed it. And we said, we have some questions to ask ourselves, but let's let it emerge and see what comes out at the end. And so here's what I think we've come up with is that, first of all, you've got to take the time you have to be really clear on the goals. Give people the goals, give people the outcomes, do that as much as you can. And quite frankly, you might want to do that with a technology assist so you can do it at scale. Once you get into the goals, then make sure that what you're asking from them, how you've defined that, is adequate, that it's good enough to get going, and then get going. It's about the speed of getting into it. And the last point is if you do that, you will find that coalition of the willing. And that coalition of the willing, once they are activated, you're going to unleash the hidden power and the hidden value in the organization that you didn't know you had. And so by sharing those goals adequately and then turning it over to people and listening to them, you're going to look like a genius just by sitting back and letting people do what they do best, as opposed to trying to give them what they do best when they probably know. And again, you're right. It's just a subset maybe, but that subset is powerful. So the goals, adequate, get going, find that coalition of the willing and activate them to get that hidden power and value.
Love it.
I think that sums it up. Is that good for you, George?
Love it. Yep.
Beautiful. All right. So thanks for joining us. Again, for those of you who are interested, the technology is LiiRN. That's at LiiRN.com. This is George Swisher, the CEO. I am Michael Leckie. I'm the founding partner of Silverback Partners. We're a change in organization development consultancy that focuses on trying to make the world a better place to work and live through human capabilities. So thanks for joining, and please reach out to any of us anytime you want to. You can go to our websites and you can get a hold of both of us personally. Love you follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever it may be, and we'd love to hear from you. So thanks a lot for joining. Have a great day, George. Thank you so much, man.
My pleasure.